All right, cool. We'll get started. So this is, I think, one of my favorite lectures because it's something that brings, I think, a lot of what we've been talking about together. A lot of what we've talked about has been about like these good things about being in a group and how to be efficient and how to perform well and how to get along. But like our experiences of groups are probably not that. Like our groups are rife with conflict. And so much of it is kind of comes back to something we mentioned in a previous lecture of if the group's goals and the individual's goals were the same, then there wouldn't be any conflict, right? And we can think about this in terms of two people, in terms of big groups of people. If two people are on the same page, if they have the same goal, then there's no conflict. It's when my kind of self-interest gets in the way of your self-interest that this stuff really starts to play out. So we're going to start by looking at the roots. Like, where does conflict actually start? And I think something that really stood out to me when I was researching this one and really getting into it, there are two terms that are used a lot in this lecture, and that's competition and cooperation. And we all kind of have this intuitive sense of what those words mean, and I challenge you to kind of leave some of what you think you know about competition aside. Cooperation is going to be very much like you've probably thought of it. Like we come together, we work together, we have kind of the same goals. Competition in the sense of conflict is really more of just, I want something different than you, and I want to kind of use my position to make sure that I get it and you don't, right? And this is something that what we're going to look at is that most conflict kind of falls on the spectrum between competition and cooperation. And it's really kind of melding those goals together that gets you from the competition kind of stance into a cooperative one. And this was something that in my own life was kind of impactful, like really thinking of like, okay, we're not coming together because we're approaching this from very different goals, from very different standpoints. Like, how do we get to the same page? And so we'll get through kind of how that confrontation process kind of unfolds, how the escalation process unfolds, and then look kind of at the end about what some of the resolution principles are. This is a little, I don't know, if you want to learn about how to fix all of the conflict in your life, you're probably not going to learn it from a couple of slides in this class because conflict is super complicated. But this does look at different kind of negotiation tactics and how the different ones and the different approaches kind of produce different results from the literature and from the research. So the roots of conflict, like where does this come from? And this is a really good kind of peek into what I was just saying. Like this is a very, very complicated thing. There's so many different places that conflict can arise from, right? It can be about your own kind of ambitions and goals conflicting with others. But the whole point is that you and these other people are just not kind of on the same page. Your motivations are different, your goals are different, your interests, all of these things. A lot of it has to do with kind of the groups that you're in, right? About where that group is going. Whether this is you and another person in kind of an intimate relationship, talking about the future and what you want to see in that future, or whether this is like an actual like work group that you're a part of, where you're thinking about the decisions that are being made, about your paycheck, about kind of where the group as a whole is going. Like all of these things kind of play into the same idea of conflict. And so these are kind of the symptoms, I guess you can say, right? Instead of working together, there's this competition. My goals are more important than your goals. And a lot of it revolves around kind of resources, right? That there's only so many resources, and this is especially true kind of at the work level, right? There are only so many paychecks that can be written from the pile of money that we have, and we need to divvy that up in a way that people think are fair. And you end up in cases where you're either perceiving kind of unfairness, that someone's taking their authority and their power too far and selfishly claiming more than they deserve, or you're in a position where you feel like everything is kind of equal and on the right page. So this last one I think is the most insidious, and this is the one that kind of is the hardest to come back from. A lot of these other ones are ones that usually revolve around tasks, around processes and things like that. The toughest ones to fix are just when people just don't like each other, right? This is when you get into affective conflict, where you're saying things that are trying to like hurt other people because you don't like them. And it's really hard to just like stick two people in the same room and just be like each other, hug each other, whatever, right? But this is a staggering statistic. Like 1/5 of all your time spent making negative comments. And you can like just think about this, right? Like think about the groups that you're a part of. Most of the conversation that's going on is bitching, right? I hate what he did. Oh my gosh, that's just not fair, blah, blah, blah. Like all of that is just building into this conflict cycle. And most of that stuff that's being said is not being said in a place where it's actually fixing anything. A lot of the time, it's behind people's backs, right? It's just griping about all of these things without ever bringing them to the surface and actually like working through them in a way that's productive, in a way that builds structure for the future. So this is where we'll kind of pull out the two terms that I was talking about, so competition and cooperation. So competition is where you're really trying to work for yourself, right? You're trying to get the resources for yourself, you're trying to get the power, the authority, whatever. You're really only concerned about you. But competition is also a really powerful motivator of behavior, especially in the workplace. This gets people motivated. It's like, oh, look, you're going to get this fancy thing and no one else will. It's going to make you feel prestigious and awesome. And people spend a lot of time trying to prove that they're better than the people around them, right? They set higher goals. They feel more satisfied because they're achieving things, put a lot more work in. But this is kind of the downfall of that competitive attitude, is that oftentimes when you are achieving something, you're achieving something at someone else's expense, right? And you're profiting off of other people's errors. And so much of this environment is about being better than these other people. And there are I have a hard time with some of the stuff in this class because it's always kind of pitched as this really negative thing. Like competition is not a negative thing. It can be very useful in the right situation. It's when it's not balanced with like proper cooperative kind of environments that it can kind of get out of hand, and it can leave people feeling disenfranchised and left behind, right? And this is kind of the atmosphere, and this is an atmosphere that a lot of you can probably relate to in the work environments that you've been in. When you're in a competitive environment, it can feel really unfriendly. Like everybody's out to get each other. Everybody's trying to get one up on each other. This happens in relationships, right? Where people are like keeping score. You didn't take the trash out. Well, you didn't get the groceries, or this and that, right? You start to develop this really competitive attitude towards each other that doesn't really fix anything. And so on the other side, and this is pitched as like a better thing, cooperation though tends to be better in a lot of different situations. Like this is what cohesion really works toward, is being able to be in a group where everybody is on the same page and they're cooperating and there isn't any conflict. But it requires like a different perceptual position. You have to be in a position where you actually care about the people around you. You care about the group succeeding and not just you succeeding. And because of that, you end up in an environment that's really friendly. People are making connections. People are becoming friends with one another. And you can kind of think about this too in terms of what we brought up a lot in this class, the difference between task and relationship kind of managing. Like competitive stuff is really good for motivating people to do well on tasks, whereas these cooperative environments are really good at forming relationships, at making the environment feel safe. And so really successful businesses are actually ones that can balance these two in a way that actually makes sense. And the same in like your own personal relationships. It's okay to be a little competitive sometimes, but you have to realize that like at the end of the day, you're there for the relationship. And you have to have some of your time spent coming together and making sure that you're cooperating and caring about the we part of the relationship. So, and this is really nice how this kind of pitches it, right? Because it is a continuum. It's not just an either or thing. You're not just always competitive or always cooperative. And so there's always these mixed motives. It's like right now it's better to compete. It's better to get ourselves riled up and to motivate us to achieve higher things. And then sometimes it's better to kind of come together and make sure we're on the same page. And a lot of this is driven by this reciprocity principle that we've talked a lot about in this class, right? And this is true for kind of negative and positive, like you smile at someone, someone smiles back kind of thing. But this is very true with kind of your cooperative or competitive stance. If you approach something from a very competitive stance, you're probably going to get competition back, right? And I like this lecture. I tend to focus more on kind of the individual relationships because I think that's where we see a lot of conflict in our lives, are those kind of dyadic relationships that we have. And so like in this case, if someone comes at you with like, you didn't take the trash out, you're going to get super defensive, right? You're going to get competitive back to them and say, well, you didn't do this and you didn't do that. And so it ends up creating this cycle where you're actually perpetuating the conflict even worse. But on the other side, if you take a cooperative stance, it's a good chance that other person is going to take one too. And so sometimes the onus needs to fall on you a little bit to, especially if you know how this stuff works, to kind of approach the table from that cooperative stance and to really kind of promote that and say, look, we're here to work on this stuff together. How can we fix this in the future so this isn't a problem? And over time, if you keep making these decisions over and over again, you're going to kind of synchronize your behaviors with one another. This could be kind of insidious though, because if you're constantly competing over and over and over again, then you're going to be stuck in that kind of a cycle. And you're constantly going to be bickering at one another, trying to figure out why the other person isn't doing what you want them to do. And this thing down here at the bottom, this is a really strong point that really kind of encapsulates that, and something that I'm sure a lot of you can intuitively kind of feel, is that negative reciprocity is a lot stronger than positive reciprocity. So if someone says something that's like competitive to me, that I didn't do something or that I'm not good enough for something, I am much more likely to come back with a lot more negativity than if someone was like, oh, hey, thanks for doing that, right? You still will have some positive reciprocity, but it's not going to put you into this like super defensive mode like negative type comments do. So this kind of highlights these different orientations that individuals can have. And so this is also not one of those like you're either this or you're that. These things tend to be on a continuum, that you can be one in one situation, you can be another in another. We've talked about individualism in this class before, but kind of the individualistic orientation under this kind of SVO model is people that are concerned with their own outcomes, right? I don't really care about the group, I care about everybody else's outcomes, I really only care about mine. The difference with competitive orientation is that competitors are really interested in maximizing their own outcomes, but they're also interested in minimizing others. This is where things can get really hurtful in conflict, right? People actually taking a stab at you, trying to minimize your position to make their position better. It's a strong tactic that people use, right? It's like, it's a way that you're able to bolster yourself up by putting other people down. And so, like I said, this really kind of steers away from what a lot of people intuitively think about the word competitive, because it's not just like we're competing for some reward or whatever. Like competition is saying that like I care about doing whatever I need to bolster myself up, even if it means putting you down. The cooperative orientation, so you'll notice that these two on top are more like pro-self. These two orientations on the bottom are when you're able to kind of think more about the group and think about maximizing the group's outcome. So in terms of like a relationship, it's thinking about you as a we and not as individual me's, right? Like how are we going to accomplish life's challenges together? And then altruism, there's a lot of debate about whether altruism exists at all, but is where you're motivated to just help others, regardless of kind of whether you benefit or not. And a lot of people argue that even if you're doing this not for anything for you, you still feel really good when you do these. So there is still some kind of like self-gratification that you get from being altruistic. And does it really matter too? Because at the end of the day, like if someone feels good because they're helping other people, they're still helping other people.
Yeah,
like, Like, yeah, whatever, like, feel good about that. You were like serving food to homeless people and they needed it, like, cool. So we'll get into some of the different ways that conflict kind of unfolds. And so a big one is resources. This is especially the case in the workplace, right? And so a lot of the times in the workplace, we're trying to maximize as much as we can for ourselves. That's why we're at that job. We're at that job to make a paycheck, to go home, to have our own life. That's a kind of new idea. Like, a lot of work in the past was about like being, your identity was being that job, right? It wasn't about making money to go do something else. It was about the place that you were at. But a lot of today's culture is driven around trying to kind of maximize as much as we can and minimizing the amount of energy that it takes to do that, right? So, and this is something that becomes really apparent pretty quickly in groups, is that we start to realize that if we're completely selfish, and if that was kind of, if everyone was completely selfish, that would kind of ruin the group, right? Like, there wouldn't be anything left at the end of the day. And so there has to be something that kind of kicks in these more pro-social type behaviors that we engage in, of actually caring about the group and not just kind of destroying it out of selfish interest. And so this comes back to that quote I was talking about at the beginning of, if the group's goals and the individual goals were in line, there wouldn't be a difference between collectivism and individualism. But the conflicts arise when kind of these individualistic goals and values and behaviors kind of get in the way of what the group is actually trying to do. And the collective usually intervenes in some way by creating norms, by creating rules, whatever that is. So we'll go through, there's a couple of slides that are pitched as dilemmas. So these are actual research studies that looked at kind of the different ways that conflict arose based on kind of the different environmental constraints that were on the group. So the social trap is very much tied in with that last slide that we just looked at, where it's looking at how groups have a certain amount of resources, right? And if everyone is selfish, if everyone is just kind of doing it for their own personal gain, then those resources get taken really quickly, right? So it ends up hurting the group long term if everyone is acting selfishly all the time. And so they've done these studies where they put people in these groups and they have like a pile of resources, a pile of money or whatever, and they tell the people that they can either act selfishly or they can work together as a group to kind of figure out what to do with those resources. You can kind of think of this dilemma in terms of like crashing on a deserted island with a bunch of people on a plane, right? You have a certain amount of resources. If everyone, or even like if there was something that shut down transportation and all you had was like the food in your house and you had to share it with the other people in your house or the other people in your neighborhood, if everyone is acting selfishly and just eating what they want, then the whole group is going to end up without anything super quick, right? And so what they showed was when you had these people in a group where they couldn't communicate with one another, then 80% of the groups bankrupted the pool within a minute in these experiments. So communication is huge here, right? Communication is huge in conflict in general. Like, that was the whole point of when we talked about group development, and we talked about the storming phase and the structure phase. Like, the way to get out of conflict is to bring it to the surface, and actually talk about it, to make plans about what to do with these resources, right? So you really have to get together and come up with a strategy, and you have to develop social norms. You have to develop rules on how we're going to handle these resources, what's considered fair, what's considered equitable. So yeah, this one is more of an issue when this is what creates free riders, right? So you're in a group where it doesn't matter how much you actually contribute, you still benefit from all of the things that the group has to give. This is big in society in general. So even if you're not a full functioning member of society, if you're not working, if you're not paying taxes, you can still use parks, you can still use the highway, you can use all of these things that your societal system created for you. But what ends up happening is that you end up with these huge free rider problems. This is something that societies have been dealing with for millennia, is how to create a system where people are all encouraged to put in work. This is why you create standards around how to get into the group and what it takes to stay in the group. We talked about like prestigious groups being attractive because you had to put a bunch of work to get into them, and it kind of eliminates this free rider problem. So these are some of the things that kind of came out of this dilemma and this research, is that in order to really get people engaged, to get people to care, a lot of it, I think, is identity processes, right? You have to get people to actually care about the group, right? If someone doesn't care, they're not going to put time in. They're not going to put effort in. And a lot of that kind of comes from these promises, right? Of like, if you want to be a member of this group, this is what is expected of you. This is what fraternities and sororities do. This is what a lot of religious institutions do, right? It's like, if you want to be a member of this church, you need to follow our rules. And if you break it, you're going to be discommunicated, right? And a lot of that are these costs, right? This is something that society in general has kind of created a set of rules that humiliate people, that punish people, that criticize people in order to eliminate these free riders, these people that just don't put in effort, don't put in work.
Does it work?
It does to a certain extent, yeah. But I think the underlying thing there is the identity process. Like, they have to care a little bit about the group, right? There's the old joke with therapy, like how many therapists does it take to change a light bulb? One, but the light bulb has to want to change. And so that's kind of the idea here too, is that like all of this stuff is only as good as how much that person cares. If you humiliate them, they actually have to care about that humiliation, about that ostracism to actually put more work in, right? But this is a really interesting kind of caveat here at the end, is that, and I'm sure it's something that a lot of us have experienced throughout our lives, is that we're often willing to put a cost on ourselves if it means that other people can't take advantage of us. Like no, and there's very interesting statistics about welfare too, that there's a lot of assumptions about who's on welfare, that when you really look at the statistics, it's oftentimes like single mothers and families that are not making enough to support their kids. So yeah, there's a lot of stereotypes around that, and our culture very much kind of influences the way that free riders are kind of pictured, right? It's like, what does it actually mean to be a contributing member of society? That's like a perceptual thing that needs to be defined, that instead of having some like clear definition from our government, it's something that we're just kind of supposed to come up with on our own. It's like, oh, well, I work harder than you, so you must be lazy. And there's not a lot of room for nuance there. I mean, this is something, this has been kind of an underlying theme throughout the whole class, is like, these are the things that I've always wanted all of you to question, right? There's so much of this that is built by us. This wasn't just created by some like all-powerful being. Like, we created our society. We created these perceptions. We created the rules around what it means to actually be accepted for the things that we're doing. And it's up to us now to question where those things came from, where those norms kind of arose, and like, we're in a position now where we have access to a lot of information where we can start kind of combating some of this stuff and thinking about different ways to approach it. We can think about being fair, right? But in a way that's still profitable, that's still competitive, that still produces amazing things. Because that's a really kind of hard rope to tightrope walk on. So this is very much about kind of the fairness, about who gets what, right? So part of this is procedural justice. So procedural justice has to do with kind of the process of how things are divvied up, right? Like making group decisions on who gets what and how we're coming to those decisions. It's the process of kind of what are the resources, how do we get them, how do we allocate them. Distributive justice is more about kind of the actual sharing, whether or not you feel that it's fair what you got and what he got. So these fall into two different categories. You can have very strong opinions about kind of the whole process of how we collect our resources and like what kind of decisions are made about what you need to do to get those resources. But at the end of the day, you get a paycheck that's less than someone else's. You can be upset about how much work you put in versus how much work someone else put in. That's a huge, huge pillar in today's society, is kind of the difference between equity and equality. Equity is more about getting your fair share depending on how much work you put in, and equality is about getting the same. Everybody gets the same no matter how much work they put in. And there's pros and cons to both sides of that. And here it is. So yeah, equity is based on how much work you put in, right? So you're getting a higher paycheck because you put in more work than the other people. Equality is that we're all getting the same reward, we're all getting the same outcome, we're working together as a team, and so we're sharing those resources, right? It's an equal payoff. I'm sure you can think of many situations where one is better than the other, and I think it would be kind of naive to say that one is just better than the other, because that's probably never the case. But a lot of distributive norms revolve around power. Who's the one that's actually in charge of distributing this stuff? Who's the one that gets to decide whose paycheck is higher than the other people's paycheck? And who gets to kind of say, you know, I'm President Shill, and I'm going to write a paycheck for myself that's like $2 million. I'm going to pay my graduate students next to nothing. Right? The revolving door of academia to some other college where I'm going to make a ton of money. I'm not upset about that at all, sorry. And this is another distributive norm. It's something that is really important to think about. This comes from utilitarian philosophy. It's this idea that we need to be giving resources to the people that need them the most, but this oftentimes comes in the face of equity, right? You have certain people that are like, well, we need to help these people. We need to give them things because they're in need. But then you have these other people that are working really hard that are like, well, I had to work for all of those things. Why is this other person just getting it for free just because they need it more? This is kind of one of the biggest debates that revolves around capitalism versus communism, is this idea that a lot of communist principles are need-based and capitalist principles are equity-based. Yeah, and this is something that is very prevalent in today's society, is conversations about responsibility, right? The people that have a lot should be expected to share. But then there's the other side of that too, of these people worked for that money in some cases. In some cases they didn't, but whose job is it to tell them that they're responsible to share all that money? And who do they share it with? Do they share it with the people that need it the most? Do they share it with the people that are working the hardest? Like these distributive norms are in conflict with one another. They're all things that we can get behind. We're like, oh yeah, I think needy people need money, but I also need money because I worked really hard, and I need money because I'm in an authority position and I'm a higher prestige than these other people. Like these all come in conflict with one another, and that's what creates these kind of internal politics and these internal conflicts that kind of spill out and make people difficult to work with. So thinking about equity, right, this is kind of along that line that I was just saying. So negative inequity is where other people end up getting more than you, even though you worked harder. There are these really interesting studies with monkeys where if you have two monkeys right next to each other, they're both in cages, they're both doing the same task, and you feed them both crackers, totally fine. You feed them both grapes, they're totally fine. If you give one of them a cracker and you give the other one a grape, they get pissed. And they'll like throw the grape at the researcher and just be like, no. This is something that cuts across different animal kingdoms, right? This is something that's very noticed when we're putting in work and we're not getting rewarded the same way as other people who are putting in less work. And this often leads people to lose interest in the group, to lose those identity principles, to not care about the group anymore because they just don't feel like they're being recognized or appreciated. Whereas on the other side, positive inequity is where you get way more money than you probably deserved. You get some like random bonus that you weren't expecting. That oftentimes increases people's efforts. They tend to work more because they're like, oh, I just got way more than I deserve. Do they think that I'm better than I am? And so they end up putting in a lot more work. This is a tactic that can be used kind of in higher management positions to incentivize higher motivation. but it also leads to other people feeling negative inequity. They're like, why did that person just get a big old bonus? They didn't do anything, right? So a lot of this idea of responsibility is very egocentric. We tend to view the things that we do as being a lot more important than the things that other people do. We think that we deserve more credit for the work that we're doing, but a lot of that is a very strong perceptual bias that we have. We only see what we're doing, right? Like, we may see the results of what someone else did, but we're not actually like watching them work, watching how much effort they're putting into it, watching how much they're actually doing. And so we end up with this really strong bias that we're way more deserving than these other people. And so a lot of the research has pointed to these kind of unpacking techniques with these kind of dilemmas, with these responsibility dilemmas, of really asking people to put themselves in other people's shoes and to really think about how much work it took to come to those other outcomes, to do the kind of things that these other collaborators are actually doing. And that tends to reduce some of this bias. And kind of going back to the last slide, a lot of the conflict in the workplace revolves around this kind of inequity, right? Of thinking that you're not getting what you deserve. And so taking a moment to just like take a step back and to actually think about, okay, these other people are working really hard. Like, okay, we're all on the same page. They do deserve that. I deserve what I got. But a lot of what happens too in the workplace is conflict over power. And I mean, this is something that our society very much drives, right? Is this climbing the ladder, trying to get up to higher and higher levels of prestige, higher levels of authority. And because of that, we've created an atmosphere where we try to form coalitions to really bolster our position. We try to take control of the information so that we're kind of indispensable. We can't be put aside, right? We kiss butt so that we're the favorites. And it puts us in a position where we end up getting more because of where we are, because we're kissing ass, instead of actually because we're putting in more work and we're doing what needs to be done. So, and this is, a lot of these that I've just highlighted kind of revolve around the workplace. But you can also see in normal relationships, in intimate relationships, there's a ton of power conflicts, right? About, like, I think that I should be in control of the finances, or like, you're just irresponsible with money, and so I should be handling that. I should be paying the bills. I should be doing this. I should be doing that. A lot of that revolves around kind of authority, having control. And that can form, like in one of the people, it can form a complete lack of control that causes pathological, physiological responses. Like feeling like you don't have any authority is a really scary place to be. Feeling like you don't have any control of your own life. And this kind of builds on some of the workplace type conflict. Is that a lot of the workplace conflict kind of revolves around the tasks that are being done. So this is conflict around the actual goals that the group has, and kind of the organization tactics that are leading those. So not liking the plans that we're making. So, but this is an interesting kind of use of language here, that groups and organizations use this conflict, right? And so they really want to pit people against each other. And this is something that I've tried to highlight in past lectures, but conflict is not always a bad thing. You want to put people that have different goals and different values and beliefs kind of at odds with each other so that you can really create a creative space to explore ideas and to see why we're not on the same page in order to create better plans and to solve problems, right? The problem is when this kind of task-oriented conflict becomes personal. And so many times we can kind of relate to this of trying to tell someone that we don't like the way that they do something, and they take it as, you don't like me, right? And this is probably the primary reason that people avoid conflict altogether, is that I don't know how to approach this task conflict without it becoming affective conflict, right? Without someone actually thinking that I'm attacking them in some way and telling them that they're a bad person. And so a lot of what needs to be done in these spaces is really creating that safe space to begin with, what you would kind of develop in a counseling setting, like we're here to grow, we're here to make things better. And especially in those situations, if you are their friend, that makes this even more complicated. Because it's like, I'm not just worried about creating some kind of affective conflict in the workplace. I'm now bringing that home in a completely different environment. Now you think I don't like you inside of work and outside of work. Like these are, and if you think back to the case study that we did with the rowing, that's what a lot of this started out as. It was like, I don't like the way that you're rowing. You're not rowing right. Turned into, I don't like you. You're not a good teammate. You're not a whatever. And so a lot of the conflict strategies are how to really kind of mitigate all the personal stuff and to kind of remove that from the equation altogether and get back to the facts about like, look, this is why we're here. We're here to grow. We're here to kind of work through this. So the other side of the task conflict is really the process conflict. And so this is more about the methods that the group is using. And so it's not just about disagreeing, it's about disagreeing on how to disagree. These types of conflicts are usually used to create like rule books and stipulations and norms around the workplace of like, how do we kind of build structure around this moving forward? And you can have a lot of conflict that kind of builds that. And these are the guidebooks that you have at any corporate setting. It took a lot of conflict to create that book, guarantee you. Like whole HR departments, there's an entire like field of academic research that is human resources that looks at how to create these rules and these procedures to really mitigate conflict altogether. So this is where it gets into the tough stuff, right? The liking and the disliking, there's a reason these are the most intense conflicts, and it's because we are self-protective, right? We have an image of ourselves. We have certain beliefs about who we are and what we bring to the table. And when someone kind of questions that, we go into defense mode. We try to prove them wrong on any account. And we get so defensive that we lose sight of what it is that we're actually even talking about. And I'm sure all of you can relate to conflicts that just like by the end of it, you're like, what the hell are we fighting about? Like, this is going nowhere. And it's just like, you end up, there's all of this negative personal stuff that comes out that, I mean, it started as like something very kind of on the surface, task-oriented. Like, we need to figure out how to work together. And all of a sudden, one person's a bitch and the other one is like the asshole, and like all of these things are getting thrown out and everybody's like super heated by the end of it. And all of that stuff was like never connected to the stuff that it started as. You become very compulsive, right? You start to bring kind of the moodiness and these long-term things into the equation. I remember my dad, when we were younger, him and my brother used to get in fights all the time. And he ended up reading this book called The Anatomy of Peace that talked about how one of the biggest things that you can do in terms of conflict is not keeping someone in a box. That when you are in conflict, that the conflict needs to be about what the conflict is about right there in that moment. And the moment you start holding every single thing that person did against them and putting them in this box of like, you're never going to get better because you just did all of this stuff and you have this track record, nothing ever gets solved. Because the fight becomes this narrative. It's not about what you're trying to fix. It's not about creating structure. It's about this grand narrative that you're trying to fight that's almost impossible. I mean, I'm in this like lovely position because I don't have the answers. I have some fancy research I can point at. Well, there's a lot of strategies that come out in counseling, that come out in a lot of things. One of them is avoiding absolutes, never using never, right? You never do this, you always do this. There's probably like no instance you can think of where you always did something or you never did something. It leaves no room for growth, right? You have to approach these things with a growth mindset. You have to say like, yes, I understand that I have done things that weren't right, that weren't good, that kind of set the table in a certain way, but I'm here now to fix that. I'm here to grow from that. I'm here to become a different person so that we can fix this moving forward. The other side of this is moving to a less kind of defensive way of moving through conflict, where it's not about you did this, you did that. It's I feel this way when this happens. And you can't really invalidate someone's feelings, right? You can't say like, oh no, you can't feel that way. It's like, no, that's my perception, that's my reality. I feel this way when this thing happens. And I would like to not feel that way when this thing happens. So again, I think the hardest part with a lot of this is that you need to create a safe space. That a lot of the time when conflict erupts, especially these types of personal conflicts, is in a moment of emotion, right? It's like nothing ever gets resolved in those moments. You're just yelling at each other. There's nothing substantive actually coming out. You're not speaking rationally. There's no actual getting through to the person. We'll talk about that in a minute. That what really needs to happen is you need to create a space where you're like, look, we're here to talk about these things, to grow from these things, and to really kind of take some personal ownership on both sides of the table. And if you can't create that space, then you can't approach it from a growth mindset. So, and this is something that I've hinted at a lot, that when we kind of evaluate people negatively, it often kind of generates conflict because people see it as personal. And this is a really big thing here. This is something that we've talked a lot about, the benefits of diverse groups, really bringing in different perspectives, about being more creative and things like that. But diverse groups are often a lot more fraught with this kind of stuff because people are on such different pages with personal goals and values and beliefs that they tend to take a lot of these things more personally. Love this picture. And this is that problem, those personal, emotional things, they tend to become very impulsive, and they tend to just, they end up in that negative reciprocity land where one insult begets another one, which becomes more defensive, which becomes more explosive, and the conflict just continues to escalate, right? And a lot of the times, like, we're hoping, especially the person that brings it up, they're hoping that things kind of end quickly, but that's usually never the case, right? This one was the one I was thinking about when we were just talking about that, is that, and this is something that I'm sure all of you can just can relate to, can kind of really see in these moments of conflict. You're just like, I don't understand. What I was saying was so rational. Like, why are they not getting this? Like, there's just like no getting through to this person. And a lot of the times in these situations, when we get defensive, our brain tends to hold on to our original beliefs. We hold on to them so hard that we're just like, no, if I give it all, if I tell this person that I'm wrong, then they're right? And that's like a scary, vulnerable place to be. And so a lot of the times when you're in these conflicts, you end up becoming more committed to your position than you were in the first place. And I'm sure that very much resonates for a lot of people, because that is one of the hardest things in conflict to get around. And a lot of the times, a lot of this is kind of this public face that we hold of I need to be seen as responsible or reliable or anything like that. And so I'm going to stick to my guns or whatever. But so much of it in these fights that we have, the miscommunication that's happening is because I believe something and I'm going to hear everything that you say, and I'm only going to take the little bits out that prove what I think, right? I'm going to ignore all of this other stuff. And that's how the brain works. When we have a goal, when we have some intention of I believe this, I want this, our brain only looks for information that actually confirms that. And it ends up kind of making these kind of stances, these commitments that we have even stronger. So if we keep hearing more information that's kind of building into it, then it gets even worse. Yeah. I mean, this is one of the things that I've been hinting at. It's not easy. I mean, there's a reason why there's entire industries that have kind of come out of this that help with conflict resolution, because this is really complicated. I think the best way, like I said, is to kind of create this safe space where both people kind of agree that we're here to hear each other out, right? A lot of what's really successful in these situations, especially with couples, is reflective listening, right? And so instead of listening and responding, and the entire time you're listening, you're just in defense mode, right? You're thinking about all of these things that they're saying, and you're seeing how all of that confirms your stance or whatever, and then you're just immediately attacking back. What you should instead do, listen to what they say, repeat what they said back to them, and ask if you're understanding it correctly, right? Because that shows like, okay, I actually did listen to you. I validated your position. I said, okay, I understand why you feel that way. Now it's my turn. You reflect how I feel. Let's see if we can come to the same page, right? It's when we're in that defensive mode that we're not actually taking time to consider the other person's perspective at all. There's I think it's in like emotionally responsive therapy. There's the LOVE acronym. L is listen, O is openly with an open mind, V is validate, and E is express, right? And so it's all about like listening with an open mind, trying to understand the other person's perspective, validating their perspective, but then still feeling confident enough to express your side of it too. And that's often what gets lost, is like being afraid of actually expressing your side of the conflict. So with a lot of this is built into a lot of the cognitive biases that we have, that our brain reinforces, right? And so it's the perception of the situation that really reinforces a lot of this stuff that we're having. So if we have certain beliefs about the world, if we have certain beliefs about that person, right? This is where a lot of that stuff gets lost, is we start to kind of imagine that we know what their intent is, right? That they're doing this to hurt us, that they're doing this for this, when a lot of the times in these conflicts, people are actually on the same page. They're just yelling at each other and have no idea that they're on the same page the entire time. Yeah.
I agree with you.
Yeah. Angrily. Yeah. And like so much of that is the beliefs that that person had about the other person, that like, okay, you're saying that you understand, but I don't believe that. Yeah. Right? Like, yeah, I don't feel understood. And it perpetuates the cycle. And so a lot of the times this turns into very distorted thinking of like really thinking that you understand where they're coming from and you are just on completely different planets. How is that avoided? Reflective listening. You'd be surprised when you get into these reflective listening type things, you start to see that like, okay, so you have a couple sitting down with a counselor, and one person will say their whole side of it, and the other person is expected to repeat it back, to reflect it back, and they'll say something completely different, right? And they'll say it from their perspective of like, so like you have one person that's just like, you know, I feel like you never understand me, that you're always doing these things that I don't want you to do and everything, and the other person will reflect it back and be like, so you're saying that I'm just a terrible person, and that I'm, right? When really the whole... Yeah, absolutely. The whole reflective process is about really repeating what that other person said, not taking it into your own head and twisting it. It's like, okay, I'm intentionally trying to just understand what you're saying, the actual words that you're saying. But yeah, I mean, a lot of it, there's like entire worksheets that you can go through that kind of detail this. It's like, okay, you say your side of it, you reflect, the other person says their side, you reflect, and then you actually take time to see like where the commonalities are, where you guys are off page, where you guys are coming together. But we don't take time to actually do that. That's the problem. That takes a lot of effort. And it takes a lot of the power of emotion out of the equation that some people use for their benefit. A lot of the times people use emotion to shut down the entire argument so that they can win, right? This is really interesting that comes out of like the competition cooperation literature is, and this is something I was just hinting at with these other ones, is that so much of the time we're misperceiving the motivations of the other people, right? We're assuming that we know their intent, we're assuming that they're trying to hurt us, that they're doing this on purpose or whatever it may be. And a lot of that, so kind of taking you into the stance of like cooperative versus competitive, right? We assume that they've become competitive, that they're now only working for themselves and that they're also trying to minimize me instead of actually trying to cooperate with us. That assumption is oftentimes wrong, right? And a lot of this is kind of tied in with the whole idea of trust, this whole idea that I just talked about of like keeping people in the box. Like a lot of like powerful conflict resolution is about resolving things in the moment and not bringing all of this past baggage into it. But what you see is that people that often take a competitive stance to begin with are the ones that are really bad at trying to figure out other people's motives. That oftentimes they just think that other people are out to get them. You know where it comes from? It comes from being raised in certain environments.
Everyone is there to spite me.
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of different flavors of this, but you can think of like where you were in the family, like what child you were. And oftentimes, I mean, this is just kind of a silly example, but oftentimes the way that we dealt with conflict being raised bleeds into how we deal with conflict when we get older. And so we take these competitive stances because that's what worked. That's the only kind of recourse we had when we were kids to get anything across to our siblings, to our parents, or whatever it may be. And so there's this whole thing called the prisoner's dilemma. I won't get like super into it. You can either cooperate or compete. But the whole idea here is that cooperators that were playing with other cooperators, only 6% of the time were wrong about the other person's motive. Competitors were wrong 47% of the time. We're constantly thinking that people were out to get them, that people were there to take something from them. And so this really plays into how this conflict unfolds in the moment. And that's what needs to be overcome. And that's what a lot of the reflective listening is about, and everything is really trying to get on the same page of like, look, I'm here to cooperate. That's why I'm here. I want to fix this. I want to move past this. I don't want to put you down. Yeah, and I mean, think about having to be scrappy and like fight for what's yours. Like that's what produces a lot of this stuff. Being in families where you just weren't getting a lot of attention, a lot of recognition. Like you end up having to put a lot of your own kind of individual effort into getting that kind of stuff. In conflict, we can have kind of the soft tactics or the hard tactics. So hard tactics are going to be kind of your threats and punishment and bullying. This is oftentimes used to intensify conflicts, and this is oftentimes used when we just don't feel like we have any other recourse. And so there's this idea that we tend to use softer tactics at the beginning of a conflict, like, look, let's figure this out, let's negotiate. But when things don't work, we start to shift to stronger and stronger tactics, and emotions get involved, anger gets involved. I've given the example of like raising a child is very much like this. It's like, come on, buddy, let's do this. Come on, buddy, we need to do this. Dude. So they did like a study. Some researchers did a study where they were looking at kind of conflict when they had this irritating Confederate that was just making problems. And the group originally was just like, hey, can we just like get on the same page? Can we do this? You need to stop, right? Come on, this is ridiculous. Can he do this? Can you do this? And that's like the experimenter, like, can you fix this? Like, and then in the most extreme cases, there was like, dude, if you don't stop, I'm gonna blah, right? And so it very much intensified to anger, to emotion. And so you see how these things kind of escalate and turn into kind of these spirals of conflict. This very much shows what can be done with like the threat of force if you have some type of power, some type of authority. So there's this game in the literature where you are like driving a truck. I don't understand the whole thing, but the whole idea is that if you and the other person like end up on the same road, one person has to back up and lose a turn or whatever for the other person to go. And what they show is that if one person has power over the other to like punish them or to get them to go back, that it ends up creating conflict, right? But, and that's only if the other person can't kind of fight back, right? And this is something I think we can all relate to in our internal conflict, is that if we feel like we're in a situation where we don't have any like counter threat, if we can't actually like match what the other person is doing, then we tend to just yield, right? But what ends up happening, and this is something that's used kind of on the higher political spectrum, is that if both people are super powerful, then they end up just not having conflict at all because they're afraid of each other. This is like the whole building up, mutually assured destruction. Yep. So I'm going to go through some of these a little bit quickly because we've talked a lot about this in the past. And this is something I've been hinting at this whole time, is that this leads to this intensifying of the conflict. The whole like from soft to hard leads to this just spiral of upward conflict. And a lot of it is this law of reciprocity. So at low levels of conflict, the participants kind of overmatch the threats of the others. They kind of raise the bar. And then at high levels of conflict, they try to bring things down. And a lot of what the research shows is that early in conflict, we tend to like send a shot across the bow, right? Of like, don't go there. And it's used to try to bring the conflict to resolution really quickly. But as things get really heated, then we start to like back off a little bit. And we're like, all right, let's maybe like bring this down a little bit. This is getting a little crazy. This is definitely a spiral that you see in lots of different types of conflict. This tends to form coalitions, especially in the workplace, right? So as kind of internal politics unfold and these conflicts unfold, you start to see these like multi-party like blocks forming of like, I'm on Team Jenny and I'm on Team Bob, like, and this tends to be very toxic in a workplace of having these blocks that form, and then you have these people that like didn't get brought in on either side, and then they feel left out, so then they feel like they have to like form their own or try to get in on one of these. Like these are really toxic. You see this a lot in work environments where like voting is really important. That you end up creating these like voting blocks that allow you to move up the chain of command and authority. Love this picture. And so we've talked a lot about kind of anger and how we get to anger, right? And a lot of what you see around conflict resolution is this whole idea of regulation, right? Trying to regulate emotions. And when you look at the human brain, the prefrontal cortex regulates emotion. And the prefrontal cortex is something you have to like actively engage. You have to like get into that mindset. The whole like Stoic philosophy is all about like, what do I do to really combat these emotions and to really put myself in a place where I'm thinking about things rationally. And so we start by kind of talking things out, but then as these initial offers don't work, then we tend to get more and more angry. That tends to become contagious and spread to other people, right? And so conflict resolution, as we kind of rush through the last little bit, and we've talked a lot about this up until now. Like what do we need to do to get things back under control? And a lot of it is about kind of getting hold of the emotion, trying to get into a more rational place, trying to figure out what the conflict is already about. But it's about kind of getting into that mode as quickly as possible is what really is the best way of doing this. So this is something you can kind of think about in terms of like individual relationships. You see this a lot in terms of like conflict in the workplace. Distributive negotiations are where like both people are like, well, I want this, well, I want this, well, I want this. And you end up, when you kind of take this route, you end up kind of at this equally dissatisfying middle ground between, it's just like, okay, well, I guess we'll just like do this because we're never going to come to the same conclusion on this stuff. Integrative negotiation, on the other hand, is one where we're really trying to take a lot of the personal stuff out. This is what is viewed as like the best way to negotiate, is to try to find out like what is the affective conflict here? What is the stuff that really has become personal, that was never intended to be personal? Let's focus on the actual facts. Let's focus on what we're trying to fix. Let's approach this from a growth mindset and really just kind of create a solution that is aimed at that specific conflict and not at the personal stuff that's come out of that. In this case, what ends up happening, and distributive is a weird term for the first one because I see it more as like a back and forth of like, it's still very much being driven by the emotional state of the group. Like, I want this, oh, well, if they get that, then we want this. And it's this back and forth thing that's like ramped up by all the emotions. Whereas in the integrative negotiation, you're kind of taking some of that into account, but you're trying as best you can to kind of not take an actual position in one of these like voting blocks and actually just focus on like, okay, what is the problem? Like what is the root of what caused all of this stuff to happen in the first place? It's hard to have this without some of this to begin with? That's a really good question, because yeah, like this is a very like ideal, like, oh, this would be great if I could just figure out what the root of the problem was. But oftentimes it's very much like tied into a lot of the stuff that started that in the first place. So yeah, that's a good question. And so this is something we've kind of talked about already. So we often misinterpret intent from other people. We think that people are criticizing us instead of our ideas. We don't trust people because we think that their motives are selfish. We assume that they have incompatible goals. So this is kind of the overall point here, is that communication is what's key here. We need to really put everything on the table. We need to talk about why we don't trust each other, why we don't want to cooperate, what we think isn't fair. And the ultimate, especially from like a management position, the ultimate thing that really needs to be done in these situations is like bringing people back to that identity, that group identity of like, why are we here? Why is this group important? Why do people care about being in this group, right? And let's kind of put all this personal stuff aside and really think about what this group itself is trying to accomplish. And that's ultimately what a lot of like the manager's role is trying to bring that kind of to the front of like, we're here for a reason. Can we kind of forget about this stuff and just fix it? So this one, okay, this is what I was trying to get to. This is a really important slide. And this is something that I'm sure as I go through each of these, you're going to pick one and you're going to say, this is where I usually fall. And it's because of how you've dealt with conflict in the past. Avoidance. So this is one of those like, I'm just going to see if this gets better, right? I'm not going to rock the boat. I'm not going to bring it up. I'm just going to let them kind of come to their own conclusion. Not going to happen. I'm sorry, but like maybe 1% of the time, someone's going to like realize on their own why you're pissed because you never told them why you're pissed, right? And a lot of the times people don't just like change on a whim without knowing why other people are upset with them. This leads to resentment, right? This one too it's not the same. Yielding and avoiding are not the same. This is something where you're still like acknowledging the conflict. You're still getting in with the conflict, but you're always giving in to the demands of the other person, right? You're eating crow a lot of the time. You're saying, I'm sorry. You're the one that's taking responsibility and taking ownership. And again, it's a don't rock the boat kind of thing, right? Like, I just want things back on an even keel. If that's what you want, I'll give it to you, whatever, okay? This is probably the worst one, right? Is that you see this conflict that you're in as a win-lose situation. That one of you has to win, one of you has to lose. This oftentimes goes hand in hand with the yielding, right? That one person is kind of very motivated in this category and the other person is very motivated in the yielding category. It's like, I don't want this to continue. I don't want this to escalate. I don't want this to just keep getting worse and worse and worse. So whatever, I'll just do what you want me to do. We'll move on. What our brain likes the most is stability, right? And if that's what we're used to, if that's what we continue to do, we're going to continue to do those cycles over and over and over and over again. And this is where you challenge those cycles, right? Is creating an atmosphere where you can agree to cooperate, when you can agree to approach things from this growth mindset and say, okay, let's put everything on the table. Let's agree that this is a safe place, that this is not a winning and losing type thing, that we're here to grow, that we're here to build structure. And that's what really leads to what you want it to, the kind of resolution that you want. So it's not a surprise that cooperation is probably the best way to do this, right? Avoiding and fighting are generally considered negative, right? It's surprising that yielding is actually considered a positive conflict resolution technique, because it actually does resolve conflict, just not in a way that's very balanced. And it's a way that creates a lot of resentment, right? Because that person that's constantly yielding is never feeling in control, is never feeling like they actually have any power in the situation. And that leads to kind of prolonged cycles. This is a really, really strong strategy. This is something that's used by political organizations. This is something where you meet the other person with what they're coming at you with. But it has to be something that's like very apparent, right? So it's considered nice, provocable, clear, and forgiving, right? So it's nice because if the other person cooperates, you cooperate. It's provocable because if the other person retaliates against you, you meet that with competition, right? You meet that with like not yielding. You're like, look, I'm going to come to the table. I'm going to defend myself. But then you also, and it's very clear that like the rules when you engage people this way, but it's forgiving because as soon as the other person starts to cooperate, you start to cooperate. So that's the idea is like, look, I'm going to meet you where you're at right now, but as soon as you're ready to come down, I'm ready to come down too.
But that means they have to go first.
Yeah, that is the problem.
Using tit for tat.
Mm-hmm.
It's like a stalemate.
Wait, what were the last two underlined?
Oh yeah, so clear and forgiving. Yep. And so I'll go through these last ones pretty quickly. This is one that I think everyone knows. Reducing anger. I think of my son's like little kid music that we listen to in the car. Little Daniel Tiger. If you're feeling mad and you want to roar, take a deep breath and count to 4. Right? Teaching mindfulness to little kids. I mean, that's what it is. It's about bringing yourself into the moment, right? Really recognizing that you have this anger. A really good, this is something that I've used. This is something that's really apparent in like Stoic philosophy and stuff. Write this letter. The one thing that this says that this doesn't say is the best strategy is to write that angry letter, don't send it, and read it a couple hours later when you're not mad. And really think about like, okay, and this is the same with like text too. I mean, I've been so guilty of like in the moment just being like so pissed off and just like shooting off this text and just completely escalating things. And you look at it the next day, you're like, I didn't need to do that. Like that was all emotion, right? And so a lot of you have been asking like, what do we do to make these situations different? You develop norms. You structure things differently. You come to agreements with these other people that like, this is how we're going to handle conflict in the future. And that's not a comfortable conversation to have. Setting boundaries is never easy. But it's something that like, if you're not taking that step, then you're just committing to the same cycles that you've been in, right? And so conflict is always going to be there, right? Problem's not the conflict itself. Conflict is good. It moves us through the structure phase. It provides rules and norms for moving forward. It's mismanaged conflict. That's the problem. It's constantly yielding, constantly fighting, constantly avoiding that's leading to all of these things, right? So if you manage it well, you can use it to your advantage. And you can really build like really good relationships with other people, with the groups that you're a part of. And that's it. Cool. We will be. So yeah, I mean, kind of rounding this all out is that, again, conflict is a good thing if it's done correctly. And we should all kind of be challenging ourselves to bring our conflict to the surface, because if we don't, it's just going to turn into resentment. And that's like the worst way to live. So we will end there.